Chapter 3. The Corridor of Questions. Calderon moved with a sense of purpose now, though his thoughts churned with the colorful visions the shard had unearthed. The labyrinth had not merely recalled memories, it had stripped away the illusions he had built to protect himself. It demanded reconciliation with his past and with the choices that had shaped him. The corridor stretched endlessly before him, its smooth stone floor giving way to rough terrain. Then the passage narrowed as Calderon moved forward, the brittle ground beneath his feet crumbling slightly with each step. The walls jutted out at uneven angles, their surfaces rough and striated with multicolored branches. He ran his hand over the surface, expecting cold, but instead found a vague warmth emanating from the notched edges. The warmth pulsed faintly in time with his heartbeat, and as he drew his hand back, a whisper seemed to rise from the walls themselves. What lies at your core? The words struck with the force of truth. Calderon staggered slightly, feeling them bypass sound and settle deep within him. The corridor itself seemed to tighten in response to his hesitation, pressing against him, insistent, waiting for his answer. The question wasn't a demand. It was a mirror, one from which he could no longer turn away. This was not a mere passage, but a crucible. Every step demanded he surrender illusions. The roles he'd played, the masks he'd donned to be seen, all felt suddenly flimsy, fragile. He gripped the violin tighter, grounding himself as his breath caught. What is left of me when all else falls away? Calderon whispered, his voice raw. The walls pulsed again, faint and rhythmic, as if alive and listening. He forced himself to move forward, though the question refused to be silenced, echoing deeper with each step. His feet crunched over brittle ground, each movement deliberate, each breath heavy with unspoken answers. The passage narrowed even more, the air thickening with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, sharp, and faintly acrid. Overhead, long, sinewy tendrils hung like roots, brushing against his shoulders. Their pliant but firm texture felt strangely organic, alive in a way that unsettled him. Each step forward made the space feel tighter. The labyrinth itself was pressing him, demanding something he wasn't yet ready to give. And then, without warning, the passage opened. He stepped into an expansive chamber, its floor soft underfoot. Looking down, he saw pale, translucent grass covering the ground, each blade swaying, responding to an unseen breeze. The air smelled of rain, though the space was dry. A light mist curled along the room's edges, rising and dissipating with a dreamlike rhythm. Towering stone columns rose sporadically all around, their surfaces carved with Baroque-inspired angular patterns that seemed ancient yet precise, remnants perhaps of a language long forgotten. Streams of water wound between the columns. Calderon crouched to touch the water, his fingers finding it warm, viscous, and unnervingly still. It resisted him, resisting disturbance, as though guarding something deeper. At the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, its surface covered in moss and lichen, the organic growth wrapping around it into a protective shell. An orb of tarnished metal rested upon the pedestal, dull yet dominating, its presence radiating an unspoken gravity. Calderon moved closer, his steps tentative as the atmosphere thickened. The air pushed against him in waves, each step requiring effort. The orb itself resisted his approach. He hesitated briefly before reaching out, his fingers brushing its cool, smooth surface. The room dissolved instantly. The brittle terrain, the soft grass, the towering columns, everything faded. He blinked, finding himself now standing on a polished wood floor. The light around him had shifted, becoming golden and warm, illuminating shelves that stretched infinitely high. It was a library. The air smelled of parchment and leather, rich and grounding, a recognizable scent that instantly transported him back to childhood. Calderon recognized this place. It was the library he had visited as a boy, his sanctuary from the world's chaos. But something was different. The shelves spiraled inward, creating a labyrinthine path that seemed to pull him forward. He walked slowly, his footsteps echoing faintly in the quiet space. Then he saw it, a figure standing at one of the shelves. The person's back was turned, but their posture was unmistakable. Calderon's pulse quickened as he approached, his steps slowing even more as recognition settled in. The figure turned. It was him. Not the version of himself who had entered, but an older Calderon, his face lined with quiet sorrow. The older version held a book in his hands, its cover blank, its pages glowing faintly with shifting text that seemed alive, never settling into readable words. "You're late," the older Calderon said, his voice calm but weighted with disappointment. "Late for what?" Calderon asked, his own voice trembling. "For yourself." The words landed with a finality that tightened Calderon's chest. He stared at the glowing book, its faintly shifting text a living record of his identity, fragmented roles, incomplete truths. "What stories have I written about myself?" He hesitated, realizing the tales he clung to, son, musician, protector, were not his full identity. "Do you see it now?" the older Calderon asked softly. "The stories you've built aren't enough. Not anymore." Calderon's pulse pounded as understanding rippled through him. He looked at the book again and realized the truth. The stories he had built were shields. They had kept him safe, yes, but they had also kept him small, constrained within the roles he thought he had to play. He had mistaken these stories for himself, convinced they were all he had to offer. But here, in the glow of the shifting text, he saw the gaps, the empty spaces between the words. "The stories I've told," Calderon murmured, his voice wavering, "they aren't all there is." The thought both frightened and freed him. There was something deeper, something truer that he had buried beneath years of expectation. He turned his gaze to the older version of himself, his eyes reflecting a new resolve. "If the stories aren't enough," he said softly, "then what lies beneath?" The older Calderon gave a faint, knowing smile and gestured toward the book. "That is what you must uncover." Calderon reached for the book, but before his fingers could touch the glowing pages, the library dissolved and he was thrust back into the chamber. The orb was still beneath his fingertips, its surface as cool and unyielding as before. Calderon stepped back, his breath uneven, his mind churning. The whisper from earlier, "What lies at your core?" and the older Calderon's words, "You're late for yourself," wove together into a single statement. Beneath everything he had done, all the roles he had played, and all the expectations he met, what indeed remained? Who was he? He turned and saw it. A question had been carved into the wall ahead, its letters precise and waiting, as though they had been there all along. "Will you play for what you cannot see?" The question gripped him. It wasn't a riddle, nor was it a demand. It was an invitation, a challenge to trust in something beyond his own understanding. Calderon stood there, staring at the words as they seemed to pulse with a soft inner light. Could he step forward without knowing the full path? Could he create without certainty? Without the safety of rules or expectations? Could he finally play for himself? The violin felt heavy in his hands now, no longer just an object but an extension of himself. Calderon steadied the bow and drew it across the strings. The first note was raw, a sound that tore through the silence, aching yet alive. The music was his own. Each note stripped away the false narratives, unraveling layers he no longer needed. The labyrinth had never been his captor. It was his mirror. As the melody unfolded, the walls before him shuddered, fraying at the edges and unraveling like weathered cloth. What once seemed impenetrable had grown old and useless with time. The fabric of the barrier began to disintegrate, the threads unraveling and drifting into the air, carried away by the song. The solid now dissolved, leaving a passage framed by the faint remnants of what had been. With each step, the ground beneath him grew steadier, the air lighter, and the faint glow ahead grew brighter. Calderon's melody swelled as he moved forward, unburdened at last, ready to embrace the truth.